In January 2000, something happened in a dying valley in the Scottish borders that nobody predicted would matter. A handful of people looked at 660 hectares of bare grass in silence. There was one tree, a single rowan clinging to a ledge. They made a decision that would quietly change Scotland forever. 25 years later, peregrines hunt above it. But in 2000, nobody looking at this valley would have believed that was possible. The valley opens into the Moffett Hills in a long sweep of grass and pale rock, the kind of view that appears on calendars and walking maps. Open, clean, Scottish. A person driving past would have seen nothing obviously wrong. The hills looked the way hills in the southern uplands always looked. Bare, weathered, wide. That was the problem. They had looked this way for so long that nobody remembered them looking any other way. 6,000 years ago, almost all of what is now open hillside across southern Scotland was forest. Paragrine would have been dense with downy birch, rowan, hazel, aspen, willow, juniper. The valley floor layered with mosses and wildflowers, raptors on the crags, the burn running through a living system, not an open channel. Then came the sheep. During the highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries, entire communities were evicted to make way for large-scale grazing. Millions of sheep flooded the hills. Sheep do something particular to a landscape. They find and destroy every seedling before it can establish. One generation of heavy grazing sets back a forest by decades. Centuries of it remove the forest entirely. Not just the trees, the capacity of the soil to grow them again. By 1993, Paragrine had one tree, a single rowan, growing from a ledge on the valley wall too steep for any animal to reach. One tree in 660 hectares. No canopy rustle, no alarm calls, no insects thickening the air above the burn. Just grass, wind, and a silence so old it had come to pass for normal. The idea Ashmole brought back from that first visit was not modest. He and Myrtle gathered around them a group of ecologists, botanists, foresters, artists, lawyers, and educators. They called themselves the Wildwood Group, and they met in living rooms across the Scottish borders for years, arguing over species lists and soil surveys, and what it would actually mean to restore not just trees, but an entire ecosystem. They drilled into the valley's peat and extracted core samples going back 10,000 years. The preserved pollen grains told them exactly what had grown in Paragrine before people changed it. This was their blueprint. Not what looked good, not what was available cheaply, what had been there. Then came the question nobody had a clean answer to. How do you buy a valley? The land cost nearly £400,000. No government grant would cover it, and the Wildwood Group had no certainty that any tree planted in that thin, compacted, sheep-grazed soil would survive long enough to matter. What they had was an idea and a mailing list. In the mid-1990s, before the internet made crowdfunding routine, before the word rewilding existed in common use, they wrote letters. They asked strangers to give £250 each to adopt a nominal hectare of a valley most of them had never visited, in exchange for the right to plant a tree they would probably never see mature. It was, by any rational measure, an absurd thing to ask. Around 600 people said yes. Another 800 made smaller donations. 80% of the purchase price came from private individuals. No public money, no corporate naming rights. Just people who read a letter and decided that this particular bet was worth making. On the first day of January 2000, the same morning the purchase completed, 100 people walked into Paragrine. The ground was winter hard. The sky was the low gray that sits over the southern uplands in January and does not lift until afternoon. People spread out across the valley floor with spades, moving slowly up the slopes, working in pairs and small groups. Nobody said much. The work was simple. Dig a hole, set a root ball, firm the soil, move on. Rowan, birch, hazel. Each species placed where the peat cores said it belonged. By the end of that first day, 100 saplings stood in ground that had held nothing but grass for 2 centuries. They were small enough that you could cover them with your hand. Someone asked Ashmole what he thought the chances were. He said he did not know. but he thought the land still remembered what it was supposed to be. The first years were harder than anyone admitted at the time. Before a single tree could establish, the valley needed a perimeter fence, 11 kilometers of it, encircling the entire catchment to exclude sheep, feral goats, and most deer permanently. It also created an immediate conflict with hill walkers who had always moved freely across that ground. Locals showed up at meetings in Moffett and asked pointed questions. The Wildwood Group answered them as honestly as they could, and the fence stayed. Then there were the deer. Roe deer found gaps. They pushed through weak sections after storms. Each winter, volunteers walked the perimeter in poor weather, checking for breaches. An experienced stalker was brought in to cull animals that got inside. This was not a comfortable fact for a project rooted in love for wildlife, a conservation effort that required killing deer to give the planted trees any chance. But without control, a single season of browsing could erase years of work. The culls continued year after year, and they continue now. And there was the land itself. Some sections of the valley were steeper than they appeared from the road, with soil so thin and acidic that establishing root systems was genuinely uncertain. In the early years, batches of trees failed. Sections of hillside looked exactly as they had before, bare, indifferent, unchanged. Andy Wilson, who became the project's on-the-ground officer, describes those years without sentimentality. You planted, you came back. Some trees had made it, some hadn't. You planted again. There were people who said it wouldn't work, not maliciously, rationally. A local farmer pointed out that the hills had been like this for 200 years and that trees planted in ground this degraded at this altitude with deer pressure on all sides were unlikely to do much. He wasn't wrong about the conditions. What he couldn't factor in was what happens when you remove the pressure entirely. Fence out the grazers completely and simply wait. What happens underground is invisible, and it happens first. Before a planted tree shows meaningful growth above the soil, something shifts beneath it. Mycorrhizal fungi, networks of fine filaments that live on and between tree roots, begin to re-establish in the ground. These networks are not a bonus feature of a healthy forest. They are the system that makes a forest possible. They move water and nutrients between trees, connect seedlings to established root systems, and carry chemical signals about insect attacks across entire hillsides. In a landscape stripped by centuries of grazing, these networks collapse. The soil does not just lose its trees, it loses its ability to support them. At Paragrins, nobody could engineer the return of the fungal networks, but as the fence excluded grazers and the first trees began to root, the soil conditions slowly changed. Organic matter accumulated, the ground structure softened, and in ways that produced no visible evidence for years, the underground system began to reconnect. Tree to tree, root to root, across hillsides that had been biologically silent for generations. You cannot watch this happen. You can only notice, years later, that seedlings are appearing in places nobody planted them, that the soil smells different when you dig into it, that the land is starting to do something on its own. Willow warblers came back before the trees were tall enough to notice. They arrived in the early years of the project, finding enough in the thickening scrub to establish territory. Small birds, common in other parts of Scotland but absent from Paragrins because there had been nothing for them. No structure in the vegetation, no insect life at the density they needed, no cover. Then one spring, volunteers heard them. The sound was small, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it meant. John Savory, the project's volunteer biological recorder, logged the willow warblers, then chaffinches. Then a dozen more woodland species arriving in sequence, each one tracking the stage of recovery that suited it, each new arrival making the next one slightly more possible. Foxes and badgers moved in, then otters along the burn, stoats and weasels. The valley filled from the bottom of the food web upward. By the time 750,000 trees had been planted, the data from Paragrins had become something researchers cited. Soil carbon and water retention had measurably improved across restored sections of the valley. The peat bogs on the high ground were shifting, slowly but stubbornly, from sources of carbon dioxide back toward the carbon sinks they had been, before grazing destroyed them. Vegetation surveys recorded species returning that ecologists had estimated would take decades longer, including wildflowers, mosses, and fungi not previously documented anywhere in the valley. What the models had not predicted was the pace. At Paragrins, in several categories, the recovery was running ahead of the timelines. Not dramatically, a forest still takes generations to reach maturity, but measurably faster than expected. The survivor tree, that single rowan that had held its ledge through 2 centuries of grazing pressure, was voted Scotland's Tree of the Year in 2020. The tree that had outlasted everything was now surrounded by thousands of its descendants, growing in soil that had finally been given the chance to receive them. Peregrines had always used the crags above Paragrins. The steep rock faces offered what peregrines require: height, visibility, undisturbed ledges for nesting. They were there before the project began. They remained through the early years of planting, watching from above while people moved across the valley floor with spades. But a peregrine above a bare hillside and a peregrine above a recovering forest are not the same thing. The falcon is an apex predator. What it needs is not just a cliff, it needs a food web beneath it dense enough to sustain hunting. A peregrine above a working ecosystem is not a decoration, it is evidence. As the valley recovered, the crags became something different, not just a nesting site, but a hunting ground above a living system. The peregrines that had always been present began to be seen more regularly, moving low across the valley, working the new scrub edges where small birds concentrated. What had been occasional became frequent. What had been a bird using a cliff became a predator integrated into a food web that had not existed when the project began. Savory noted it in the monitoring records, not as a dramatic event, but as a pattern accumulating across seasons. The peregrines were there. They were using the valley in a way they had not been able to before. The system beneath them had grown into something worth hunting. The work is not finished, and Ashmole says so directly. He is 90 years old. He has watched the valley change for 30 years, and he knows exactly how much still needs to happen. The perimeter fence requires constant maintenance. Deer management is permanent because without wolves or lynx to regulate populations naturally, the cull must continue indefinitely. There are no corridors yet connecting Paragrins to the other rewilding sites growing across southern Scotland. The vision of a genuine wild heart of southern Scotland requires land, money, time, and cultural shifts in how people think about what these hills are for. Beyond Paragrins fence, the hills remain as they were in 1993. Bare grass, wind, the sound of a burn in open country, landscapes that look natural because nobody alive has seen them as anything else. Ashmole said they wanted to make a small repayment of their debt to nature. He was describing a motivation, not a completed transaction. On the 1st of January 2000, 100 people walked into Paragrins in the January cold and planted trees in ground that had held none for 2 centuries. Some of those people are no longer alive. Some have come back with their children, walking through scrub that was a bare hillside when they first stood there with spades. The valley sounds different now. Wind still comes through, but it moves through something: branches, leaves, the understory that was not there before. Willow warblers in the scrub, ravens calling from the crags. The burn running through a valley that has started, slowly, stubbornly, to remember what it is.